Hey, Shalom, Shalom. First and foremost, I want to say call halal, Yahweh, Ba'ashem, Yahweh Shai, Ba'ashem, Rakah, Kodash. I send double honors to the apostles, elders, and bishops of Great Millstone. Send much peace, love, and salutations to Yakim out there pushing the word of Yahweh, Ba'ashem, Yahweh Shai, and sincerity and truth. This is Brother Ariella. And on this lesson, I'm going to name it Continually Are They Gathered Together for War. I want to talk about this United States versus Venezuelan conflict, which is just another move by Esau, through the United States to, preemptively strike and control governments and steal their resources. Because what they're saying is, we have these narco terrorists that need to be stopped. They're sending fentanyl, cocaine, and other illegal drugs over to the United States, and we're not gonna take it anymore. We're gonna stop these guys. But in all actuality, they're really just trying to uproot Maduro and make sure that they have control over Venezuela, because they don't want outside influence from Russia and China and stuff like that in their backyard, so to speak. Because there's a impending war, World War III. So these are strategic moves to make sure that that they shore up certain holes that might be out there. So Psalms 140:1 says, "To the chief magician, a son of David, deliver me, O Lord, from the evil man, preserve me from the violent man, which imagine mischiefs in their heart." And that's imagining mischief, saying, "Oh, we're doing a war on drugs." They come up with all types of propaganda. The war on terror, this and that, in order to fulfill, their mischiefs, right? To suck down resources and everything like that. So they imagine mischiefs in their heart. Continually are they gathered together for war. They have sharpened their tongues like a serpent. Adder's poison is under their lips. Selah. Keep me, O Lord, from the hands of the wicked. Preserve me from the violent man who have purpose to overthrow my goings. All right, and they've purposed to overthrow everyone's going. But there's been a very, very sharp campaign by Esau through Donald Trump and his administration to take down you so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans in particular. They're getting ready to roll on Chicago. They've already rolled on DC and other cities. They're making sure to deport the Latin tribes, and now they're rolling on the Latin tribes down there in South America so they can control that. So continually are they gathered together for war, man, and there's a lot of preparation going on for World War III, and that's what I want to highlight today and talk about. Even so much to where you have Trump signing this order to rename the Department of Defense. I'm going to play this.
And sources tell ABC News President Trump is rebranding the Department of Defense as the Department of War. According to a White House official and other sources, President Trump will sign an executive order on this today. ABC's White House correspondent Karen Travers has the latest. And now, Karen, a formal name change requires congressional approval. So what's the president trying to do with this executive order?
It's a rebranding, as you put it, Diane. The president has long said he wants to do this. He thinks this is better reflective of what the mission is there at the Pentagon, at the Defense Department. And so today with this executive order, he is saying that you can call it.
Now, Trump was campaigning of getting us out of wars. And since he's gotten to office, he's done nothing but the opposite. He's funded the state of Israel to do more and more strikes and attacks over there in the Middle East. All right, he's basically setting up a war now against Venezuela and soon to be, I guess, Mexico. Sending more weapons over to Ukraine. Fermenting more and more World War III. Showing you that these people, they're fueled by the spiritual demon Satan to deceive, lie, manipulate, rape, rob, and murder, man. These are the seeds of the wicked. Okay? The seeds of the serpent.
the Department of War. But in order to formally, officially change the name of the department, that would have to go through Congress. So what this means now is that through the official correspondence, for ceremonies, and through some non-statutory documents, it could be called that. The Secretary of Defense, now Pete Hegseth, could be called the Secretary of War, but you can still call him the Secretary of Defense. The president, again, as I said, has been threatening, saying he wanted to do this for some time. Even this executive order has been teased for several weeks now, but today the president taking this action, but really a rebranding more than a formal name change.
Boom. So, that's the spirit, man, because that's what we're telling you these people are getting ready to do. They're getting ready to pop this thing on off, man. And we say, call hello, Yahweh Shem Yahweh Shah for that. All right. So now with dealing with the situation in Venezuela, what you keep hearing about is something called the Monroe Doctrine. And I just went ahead into Chat GPT so we can just get a real quick breakdown of that so brothers can understand if they don't know. And then we'll get a few more clips. It says this: the Monroe Doctrine, 1823, announced by President James Monroe. It was essentially a foreign policy principle declaring that the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, was no longer open to European colonization. The U.S. would oppose European interference in the affairs of independent nations in the Americas. In return, the U.S. promised to stay out of European wars and conflicts. And that's absolutely never happened. In short, Europe, stay out of the Americas. This is our sphere of influence, right? It says, over time, the Monroe Doctrine became a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy, often invoked to justify American intervention in Latin America. Later additions, like the Roosevelt Corollary in 1904, took it further, claiming the U.S. had the right to intervene in Latin American nations to preserve order. To preserve order, right? And it just shows this dude is a snake, right? Meanwhile, they're doing nothing but making way more chaos. Psalms 55:21 says, the words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. His words were softer than your oil, yet were they drawn swords. Right? Constantly looking for avenues of rape, robbery, murder, and death. Now, I also typed in what is the Monroe Doctrine's relevance to the U.S. and Venezuelan tensions. It says geopolitical influence. Number one, Venezuela under leaders like Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro have often rejected U.S. dominance in Latin America and instead aligned with powers like Russia, China, and Iran. From the U.S. perspective, this undermines the Monroe Doctrine's principle of keeping external non-American powers out of the Western Hemisphere. Oil and strategic resources. Venezuela has some of the world's largest oil reserves. U.S. sanctions and attempts to influence Venezuelan politics, it says, reflect not just economic interests, but also a Monroe Doctrine-style desire to prevent adversarial powers from gaining a foothold. 3. Foreign military presence. Russia has sent military aid, advisors, and equipment to Venezuela. The U.S. often frames this as a direct challenge to the Monroe Doctrine, since it looks like European or modern non-Western powers are intervening in the Americas. Diplomatic rhetoric. U.S. officials still explicitly invoke the Monroe Doctrine to interfere in Venezuela. For example, in 2019, John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, said the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well. He was referring to U.S. efforts to pressure Maduro to push back against Russian and Cuban involvement. Bottom line, the Monroe Doctrine is relevant because U.S.-Venezuelan tensions are not just about Venezuelan domestic politics. They're about whether outside powers, Russia, China, Iran, Cuba, should have influence in the Americas. The U.S. continues to see this as a violation of its longstanding claim to regional dominance under the Monroe Doctrine. See? And so they're just using this whole drug cartel propaganda crap to basically have more power, have more control. And we know what the scriptures say about this, man. You know, in Habakkuk 2, verse 4 says, "Behold, his soul which is lifted up is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. Yea, also because he transgresseth by wine." He wants everybody to follow his doctrine, his way, his laws, right? "He is a proud man, neither keepeth at home, who enlargeth his desire as hell, and is as death, and cannot be satisfied. But gathereth unto him all nations, and heapeth unto him all people." And so this is what he wants to do. That's what the Monroe Doctrine was all about. It was just to heap upon themselves more power amongst the Latin tribes, man. There's a huge push right now from Esau to take down you so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans. They coming for you, man. You best believe. You best believe. I'm going to play this clip here from Redacted where they were talking about this strike that happened on this Venezuelan cargo ship that reportedly had, tons of fentanyl on it. Unverified, unproven. But they're just going to talk about it. I'm just going to play a few minutes.
You're asking the right question. I mean, first of all, by any legal assessment that I can find, this was an extrajudicial execution. This was not something within any sort of legal framework that anybody in the world takes seriously, certainly not within the legal framework of the United States. Equating terrorism and drug trafficking is something that you cannot do with the wave of a hand, which is essentially what President Trump has done. Now, I too have been asking the question why, at this point in time, when the Ukraine war is far from over, there are more people who are going to die over there until we see change in governments in Europe, which I think is coming, fortunately, and that will help. And I think we're going to see another round of warfare in the Middle East involving Israel and Iran and potentially other countries, including Russia and China. So the question is, in view of this, why now, out of the blue, is Venezuela at the top of everyone's target list? Now, we know that there were people like Elliot Abrams during the first Trump administration who was anxious to go to war against Venezuela and potentially others in Latin America. But why now? We look at oil and gas. We know that they're at the top, in the top three of oil and gas reserves and potential. But the notion that somehow or another this is the driving factor doesn't really pass the smell test. Why? Well, we have thousands of technicians, oil and gas field engineers, people who, if they went back tomorrow to Venezuela, could begin rapidly restoring the Venezuelan oil and gas industry, something that would help the people of Venezuela, but also would be very good for us in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, and I was saying this to the brothers, when you look at this thing, there's really no reason for the U.S. to do these strikes just for this oil, because even we have tons of oil, by the way, here in the United States, and the oil that Venezuela has is not really, it's low grade. So there's another strategic angle that's at play, and having Venezuela be an ally to Russia, China, Iran, and be so close, so to speak, is another angle, and it adds another layer to this thing when you look at World War III and the algorithm of it in general.
It would make more sense to meet privately with the president of Venezuela and say, we know you've got problems, you've got too much of your population living in poverty. Instead of fighting over this, we could assist you in these areas. These are some areas of interest to us. They also have gold mines and emerald mines. We can certainly benefit from converting some of our currency into gold again, certainly improving our position in that area. I mean, all of these things are swimming around in the back of my mind. And instead of this, we've now identified Maduro with massive drug trafficking. And I think it's also the mistaken notion that the arrival of a couple of hundred people from Russia or China, the parking of 2 Russian aircraft on the tarmac down in Caracas, is evidence for imminent intervention that's aimed at us by the Russians and the Chinese. It doesn't make any real sense. Maduro, frankly, has very little influence over his own general officers, to be frank. He probably has a little more influence than the president of Mexico has over the Mexican army, which is entirely under cartel influence and control. But, again, why suddenly...
Yeah, and that's true. When you look at Mexico, when you look at Venezuela, even Colombia, the cartels and drug traffickers really run the country. A lot of the politicians are nothing but puppets for them anyway. And there's factions of these groups that are out there that the CIA has infiltrated, that the United States controls. Most of the drugs is coming out of Colombia. They're not going to attack them. Now, I talked about that in the last lesson that I did concerning Maduro and this whole situation. So if you want to get that breakdown, you can go there. Venezuela is not a threat to the United States. It's a peon. So it's a strategic move that's happening.
Venezuela, and why are we interested in destroying the place or invading it? Strategically, there's no benefit to it. And the third order effects are very dangerous. What happens in Colombia? What happens in Guyana? What happens in Brazil? I mean, the effects could be felt all the way to West Africa strategically. All in all, this is not a good idea. So why is he doing it? Is this to divert attention from obvious failures to bring the war to a close in Ukraine? Is this to divert attention from what is coming between Israel and Iran? There's no benefit to us. If anything, you could probably end up with more refugees trying to escape the carnage and find their way north to us, which is the last thing we need. Again, none of it makes any sense strategically to me.
This episode is brought to you by Rumble.
Good stuff, yeah. And so he's breaking it down that they just got demons on them. A lot of this stuff is just fuel. The Most High sending angels into the minds of the men, the kings of the earth, to fight and just to cause chaos. That's what's happening, man. We read these scriptures. We read about these people. They can't stop. Isaiah 5:8 says, "Woe unto them that join house to house, that lay field to field, till there be no place, that they may be placed alone in the midst of the earth." There's just an insatiable need to conquer, kill, maim, destroy. It's nonstop on the block for Esau right now. There's a spirit out there. That's why they're running all across America, gathering up tribes. Man, we just getting started. We're getting closer and closer to Jacob's trouble. Right? Everything is speeding up. Let me play this.
And why these U.S. warships are parked off Venezuela's coast, we have to start with its geopolitical importance. So Venezuela sits at one of the most strategic pieces of real estate in the Western Hemisphere, right near the vital shipping lanes to the Panama Canal. And beneath it all, they have the world's largest proven oil reserves, although it's heavy oil that's harder to refine. Venezuela is only about 1,000 miles away from Florida. Its close proximity and socialist ways are why it's being called the new Cuba of the Second Cold War. And as with all sequels, it's much bigger, with a population of 30 million people and a gigantic 350,000 square miles of territory. Its topography is made of dense jungles and mountains, which would make an invasion a real pain.
Venezuela, that was some mean bush.
They have over 500,000 combined active duty and reservists, a modern arsenal of Russian main battle tanks, fighter jets, and Iranian kamikaze drones within striking distance of America. But the irony is that not so long ago, this same geography made Venezuela America's strongest ally in all of Latin America. So what went so very wrong? Dictator Juan Gomez seizes power in 1908 and decides to open the doors wide up to U.S. oil companies. America has the industrial know-how to develop his nation's untapped oil fields. Within just a generation, the U.S. Venezuela...
And that's why you get Citgo and these other gas stations that you go to, or former Venezuelan partner gas stations.
Partnership transforms the nation into the largest petroleum exporter in Latin America. It's a win-win. With their 50-50 split of profits, that makes the country flush with guap. They've got cold hard cash, and it's just in time for World War II. Venezuela fuels the Allied war machine. They provide 50% of all U.S. oil imports, becoming their single largest oil supplier. This is a huge strategic win for America because it only takes 3 days to ship oil from Venezuela compared to the 30 days that it takes to get oil in from the Middle East. The U.S. sends dozens of Sherman tanks and fighter aircraft as a sign of affection, but the military bromance between the two nations is just beginning to blossom.
And if you know that there's about to be a major conflict in the Middle East that y'all gonna kick up, You would need to have those oil reserves in hand if major war is going to kick up. So that's even more evidence strategically of why, just out of nowhere, the United States has this bloodlust for Venezuela. You see?
Because in 1947, the two countries joined what's called the Rio Pact. It commits them to helping each other defend the Western Hemisphere against any outside attack like, communism. The Rio Pact is a lot like NATO, but for the Americas instead of Europe. It even has an Article 3 clause that states an attack on one is attack on all. At its height, everybody who's anybody in the Western Hemisphere is part of the Rio Pact. It's now the 1950s, and Venezuela tosses aside its form of dictatorship and authoritarian rule. They become a stable democracy with elections and all that good stuff. This puts them in even closer alignment with the United States government. In fact, Venezuela's friendship allows it to avoid all those brutal coups and military interventions that the US conducts throughout Latin America in the Cold War. And this is only the beginning. These two nations' relations are on fire in the best way. Because in 1973, the Arab oil countries withhold oil from the United States. Venezuela steps in and helps out to reliably supply oil to America throughout that embargo. And things could not possibly get any better. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Then in 1976, things start to shift. Venezuela nationalizes the oil industry, which ends direct US corporate control of its oil fields. So overnight, Exxon's forced to hand over control to the new Venezuelan state-owned oil company. Now the relationship has started to shift, because the United States is simply buying the oil from Venezuela instead of owning it, which means future Venezuelan leaders could use oil as a political weapon against Washington. But that was a problem to worry about in the future. All relations have their ups and downs, and for now, relations are reaching an all-time high. It's the 1980s, and Venezuela just signed the Peace Delta program. It allows them to receive 24 of the advanced American F-16 fighter jets, so that's where they got them. They're actually the only Latin American country to be granted this powerful capability directly. American armored vehicles, European fighter jets, and a whole fleet of modern naval frigates start flowing in. Venezuela was looking like a full-on petro-state democracy. But underneath the boom, the resource curse is about to show its ugly head. The resource curse is the fact that Venezuela is 95% dependent on oil for revenue. This is a major risk. It's a huge liability because in the mid-1980s, the price of oil collapses from $30 a barrel to under $10.
So basically, after this happens, so just to make a long story short, the price of oil crashes. They have to go to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to get a massive loan. Under those loans, they make crazy economic restrictions, political restrictions, and that's where you basically see the relationship between Venezuela and the United States make a massive turn and leading us all the way up to what we got today. Okay? So that's, Hugo Chavez, all that. All right? So I'm going to let this play, and then we're going to wrap it up. I just want bros to be informed.
Carbide program turns oil into diplomacy. It buys him allies, which in turn buys him votes at the UN. These votes are then used as a block against US projects. US agencies like the National Endowment for Democracy start to fight back. They send millions of dollars in funding to Venezuelan opposition groups and media outlets in an attempt to weaken Chavez's power or
talking about Chavez, we all know about that.
Order on America's enemies for support. He sells cheap oil to China, invites Iranian.
Okay, there we go. I want to get to the Maduro part.
Much of the Venezuelan public rejected as fraudulent. The problem is, Maduro doesn't have the je ne sais quoi of Chavez. He doesn't have the popular support and love that Chavez did. And to make up for this, Maduro jails major opposition candidates. They escape into exile as well. And in 2019, Washington indicts Maduro in U.S. courts as a narco-drug trafficker and places a $10 million bounty on his head for his arrest. In response, Maduro leans even harder on America's enemies for support. He sells cheap oil to China, invites Iranian Quds Force operatives, which is like their version of the CIA, to establish the largest military drone production facility in all of Latin America on Venezuelan soil, pumping out armed Shahed-style attack drones, the same type that Russia's using against Ukraine. We are on a full-blown collision course now Gentlemen, with the claims of widely believed fraudulent election in 2020, the U.S. takes even more drastic steps. President Trump institutes sanctions on Venezuela, cutting off what little oil purchases remained, and the economy there goes from bad to worse. The foreign policy goal switches to trying to force regime change by preventing Maduro from being capable of paying his forces. With millions of dollars in bounty money on the table, a group of mercenaries with 2 former U.S. Special Forces operators attempt to land on Venezuelan beaches to capture Maduro and overthrow his government. The plan to exploit what they believe will be thousands of soldiers who will join up against them doesn't pan out. The plan fails almost immediately. Several are killed, and Americans are captured and imprisoned.
Venezuelan authorities killed 8 of the men whom they described as mercenary terrorists.
With smuggling of drugs, gold, and selling cheap oil to China, it means that Maduro has enough to pay his forces for their loyalty, and this rekindles talk of the Monroe Doctrine, a 200-year-old principle that warns rival powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. It's originally supposed to be an agreement for the U.S. and Europe to not mess in each other's backyards, but over time it morphs into something much bigger. It becomes a foundational pillar of U.S. dominance in the hemisphere. The strategy believes the U.S. cannot become a great power of the world if it's concerned about adversaries at home, so Washington uses the Monroe Doctrine to justify various bloody interventions like in Panama, coups and occupations across the hemisphere. But in Moscow and Beijing, they claim that the doctrine is really about pushing American imperialism. They claim it's hypocritical because at the same time the United States stations troops on Russia's border and sails warships through China's coastal waters. America's response to that is they claim it's about defending sovereignty of smaller nations. As Venezuela's economy entirely collapses, 7 million Venezuelan citizens flee the country, many of them to the United States and neighboring countries, causing an immigration crisis across the Americas. Gangs like Tren de Aragua start showing up in U.S. cities, driving discussions about border security and immigration debates. What was once foreign policy has quickly become domestic politics inside the United States. And that's when in 2023, Maduro sees a possible way out of his predicament. He sees a way to claw back all his oil wealth and his position of power domestically. He claims the disputed region from his tiny neighbor Guyana. The recently discovered oil reserves found there can make the much smaller nation of Guyana the world's fastest growing oil producer. Maduro uses this threat of military action as a domestic rallying point. He claims it's to defend sacred Venezuelan territory. He uses this as new leverage to pressure American oil companies that want a piece of that crude oil. Maduro uses the possible invasion as justification to buy more military equipment from the Russians, Iranians, and Chinese. Venezuela deploys troops right to the border of Guyana and begins building new military infrastructure to create a credible threat of an invasion force. Guyana has only 4,000 troops, so they call for backup. The United Kingdom sends a warship to support them, and the U.S. under the Biden administration begins holding joint military drills in solidarity and doing flyovers with fighter jets. They state that they're supporting Guyana's sovereignty, and they increase the reward for Maduro's arrest of $15 million. Now that brings us to today, and the most recent escalation. The U.S. government is once again applying maximum pressure campaign against Venezuela by first increasing that bounty to $50 million for Maduro's capture, and now with sanctions so far failing to create changes in the politics in Venezuela, the U.S. government is turning to an old strategy, also from the 19th century, like the Monroe Doctrine, gunboat diplomacy. They're attempting to use a naval force to pressure Maduro into compliance without outright declaring war. And that's why when you see 7 U.S. warships off Venezuela's coast today, it isn't just about drug cartels likely, it fits a long pattern of power projection. Today, U.S. naval deployments surrounding Venezuela are too large to simply be to counter drug trafficking. You don't need guided missile destroyers and amphibious landing vehicles to do that. But the strike force is also too small for a full-blown invasion, which would require an aircraft carrier and many times more troops. Instead, the fleet of warships is exactly the right size to project power and put pressure on Maduro by forcing him to pay money, millions of dollars, to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people and equipment and troops, funds that, as we just learned, his nation does not have. It puts his forces into an alert status and forces him to react. He then went on to claim to have mobilized 4.5 million armed citizens and is threatening to call up a full republic in arms, which would be a tremendous sap on his resources. If this pressure were to be sustained, it could lead to a coup against him, or at the least a thorn in his side. If this wouldn't be the...
Now, this is what I was saying, Basically, the United States is trying to draw out an internal coup by having this $50 million, bounty on his head, and economic turmoil that's going to be kicked up with him having to do all of this stuff because it's unsustainable for Venezuela, man. So it's all just politics. All is just politics that we see. And it's going to do nothing but lead to more and more tensions. More and more tensions that people are going to have against Esau, leading up to Armageddon, because all these nations are going to realize they're going to have to gang up on Esau. Pretty much. All right, so I'll close with this one. This is Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 29. It says, call together the archers against Babylon, all ye that bend the bow. Camp against it round about. Let none thereof escape. Recompense her according to her work. All right, according to all that she have done, do unto her. For she have been proud against the Lord and against the Holy One of Israel. Therefore shall her young men fall in the streets, and all her men of war shall be cut off in that day, saith the Lord. Behold, I am against thee, O thou most proud. And you best believe America is the most proud today. This is why we call it, we know that this is Mystery Babylon the Great. Because ancient Babylon didn't fall by, a massive war and absolute destruction. All right? When you read in the book of Revelation, the 18th chapter, it talks about Mystery Babylon the Great. That's talking about America. And these end time prophecies that you read in the Old Testament is talking about America as well. Okay? So verse 31 says, behold, I am against thee, O thou most proud, saith the Lord, a power of hosts, for thy day is come, the time that I will visit thee. And the most proud shall stumble and fall, and none shall rise him up. I will kindle a fire in his cities, and it shall devour all round about him. Okay? So yeah, as these nations get more and more pressure, that's why you go back to Habakkuk, the 2nd chapter, it talks about that shameful spewing is going to come upon the wicked, man. So with genocides that's happening over in Gaza, the war in the Ukraine, now the potential war in Venezuela, all the other regional conflicts that you see around the world is just going to make these nations finally rise up. Okay? So, Lord willing, that was edifying. I just wanted to kind of go over that news and that information. We'll see what happens, man. All right. With that being said, I'm going to say, call halal Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushua, Ba'ashem Rakah Kodash. Double honors once again to the apostles, elders, and bishops of Great Millstone. Much peace, love, and salutations to you brothers out there pushing the word of Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushua, sincerely and true. Shalom.